Let me show you now how we can load and then apply different textures to our design and environment inside Blender. I will start the design demo file, and what you will see is this. It's a basic plane with a cube, and the cube has a bevel modifier added to round the edges a little bit. Okay, this will be a little bit compressed because I just want to give you a brief understanding and an overview about how the node editor works, how we can load materials, and how that is actually also connected to the file system and how the software finds the different resources. Okay, so first, this 3D view I would like to slice horizontally a little bit, and then inside the lower viewport I will load the node editor. The node editor, here we can press N to close a property panel, is a representation of for example our material, like a flowchart, and you will see that just in a second. And we will use this for creating materials most of the time. So let's start with the environment. So inside the properties menu, we can go to the world, and then you should see new. But before we click on this one, make sure the render engine is set to cycles and not to Blender render. Click new, and you will see this. So basically a lot of tabs for different information, but the one that's currently only of importance for us is the Surface tab. Surface tab, that's basically the tab where the material will be defined, which we will use to texture our world. Currently, the surface is set to background. So background actually means whatever we give this surface will be mapped like a sphere 360 around our environment. We have a color set to gray, and the strength of our light or background is set to 1. Let's go with the mouse down here to the node editor, and you see there is the objects button, and here the world button we have to the right there. And you see also here for object there's a new button, and when we go to world, well, we can't create a new button because we already have one loaded. Okay, so you can use both at the same time, and they basically also show the same data just in different representations. You see here this kind of like a top-down menu, and then here this is a flowchart. Here's our background, the color, and the number. For example, if I adjust this to maybe 0.8, you see this adjusts. If I set this to 2, this adjusts. So it's exactly really the same, just two different representation styles. And then here you see this green dot and green dot. There's a yellow and a gray. Gray are numbers or values, yellow are textures, and then green, that's for shaders or materials. So the background output will go into the world output input for surface, and whatever ends here will be rendered. Talking about rendered, inside the 3D view, press N, and then we can go to display, and then turn world background on, and you see this. So if I set this to 1, you see it gets dimmer. If I adjust the color, if you want to hurt your eyes, work with a really bright green background color. You see it previews everything. Let's set this back to 8 and 1. Okay, so this is just the world background. Okay. Now if we go to rendered, it will take all this information and create an actual 3D rendering for us. And now you see this is the color, so the bright environment, that's the strength. If you set this to 5, it's overexposing because it's too bright. If we set this to 0.1, it's very dim. 0.01, it's nearly black. 0, well, there is no light. And with this setup for the environment, as you can see, it's kind of like you turn on a light, but the light is coming from all directions, from the top, bottom, left, right, in front, behind, everywhere, which means it's a very flat looking illumination. It's okay when we start maybe trying to want to render a little bit, a preview or so. We don't really want to work with lights, etc. yet, or highlights, because this world setup runs pretty fast. But hey, there is this studio image. First, this is also not a JPEG, this is an HDRI, so high dynamic range image. This is, it has more bits in color information, which means we have more color tones the render engine can use to calculate the illumination. So for example, where something is white in this image, white light emits. Something is red, red light, black, very dark. So based on the color and the intensity, the light color is being emitted from this image. And you see this image is kind of flat and distorted, looks like a panoramic image, but you might notice that the right and left edges perfectly match up, because this landscape image inside the world we can map or wrap around our environment. To do this, let's go back to material, and we have this world background still turned on. And I'm going to show you now how we can load this image and use it for our background. So instead of a white, we will use that image. I show you both ways how to do it. For example, in the property menu and then in the node editor. So wherever you have this rectangle with the dot, that means you can click on it and there is a menu below. So click on this one and then environment texture. Not image texture, environment texture. That's the one we need. And then we get a file selector. Click open. I have to go now to desktop, design resources, HDRI, and there is that file. Open. Good. And now you see when I rotate my view, there is the environment. Perfect. If you don't see it and it looks like this, then that's because you are in orthographic view. You have to be in perspective view, so press 5 on your numpad to switch to that view. Okay. And you also see here now we have the environment texture. The yellow output was connected to the yellow input for the background. To move something around with the left mouse button, click and drag. Nicely, we can also press G and an X, for example, to only slide it along the X-axis. We can also press S. No, we cannot. I thought maybe with 2 we can scale them to each other. Okay. And we can even rotate them. So all of the commands are the same from 3D view and here. That means to delete this one, we can press selected and then press X and it's gone. Okay. Now to add that node, the environment texture, we can go to add, texture, environment texture, or like in 3D view, Shift A for the add menu, in the node editor, Shift A for the texture or material add menu. Environment texture. Okay. Then we can drag left mouse button, click on the yellow dot, drag it to there. If you would like to disconnect, for example, the right yellow button and click and drag it out. Or on the left, nope, I can only drag 2 because that's the input, so we drag it out. Or we can also hold the control key and then drag with the knife through these lines, and you see then it's gone. You could even select two nodes, which makes sense. For texture goes into background, and press F for fill. And then it connects all the stuff for us. So you see there are many ways how we can actually edit or do these connections. And I'll show you all, basically then up to you again to figure out or decide which one you would like to use. No, I can now click on the open, but because we had this file already open before, I can click on the selector here and then go to Studio 19. You see it has a 0, it's not being used, and there we are. Perfect. Now let's do a small rendering, and there you see now how actually this looks much more interesting. So there's a little bit of shadow behind the object. A light comes from the left and the right, so the shadow actually grows this way. This looks a lot more interesting than just this. And that's just because we're using this environmental image, which has these two huge, those two huge umbrellas to illuminate our environment. See, maybe with 2, way too much, 0.5, 0.2, okay, maybe a little bit more strength. So what do you put in for strength? That's always subjective based on what background image you're using. Okay, we will go into those things a lot more later in the following texturing exercise. I just, with this video, more want to give a prep understanding. Okay, so let's go to the rectangle. Then, for example, now we can go either to the object, and you see with the object there we have materials button. It has nothing there yet. So in this case now here I will go to the object, because in the node editor I can only add a material, which is a property to this object. Click new. See, now it has a color. Roughness means how rough the surface is. I will explain those later a little bit. So now here, Shift A, texture, and because this is not environment, this is an object, we can select image texture and then drag this one down, open, and now I can go to design resources, textures, and for example, concrete. So and then if we rotate the view a little bit, we don't really see anything, what's going on. Well, the thing is, and this is important for you to understand, so we have a material. We say this material should be a diffuse, so flat material, and we give it this texture, the concrete. But the software has no way to figure out now how do I want to take this concrete image and glue it over my rectangle. So I have to also give it information about mapping. In real life we can take, for example, a poster and hang it onto a wall. We do the positioning. For the software we have to tell it how it has to be positioned. And to do this we can zoom out a little bit, and then inside the node editor we can go to add and then input and select texture coordinate, and then for example we can drag object into vector, and then you see there is now for example this image, or for example generated. Okay, there are a few steps missing, which I will explain later, but I will keep it at this for the moment. So let's go to the cube. For example, here I will create a material, go to image. Every time also when you see this magenta color, that means an image link is missing. You see this is empty. Open, let's go back to textures, wood, and let's zoom in. And also here, this doesn't really look the way how I want it to look. So let's go add, input, texture coordinate, and for example object, And yeah, this is maybe not too bad. So what's happening here? This looks a little bit funny. So let me talk about this object and generate it, etc. So basically we tell this material to use a texture. Flat, basically think about flat like a projector from the ceiling along the z-axis. Project this image onto or over this cube by using the size or proportion of the object. Because we can, for example, scale a texture down or bigger, but we want, for example, the size of the texture to match the size of our object. So we select for the texture coordinate object. And then when we switch flat, for example, to box, you will see box means the texture is being projected from each side, left, right, front, back, top, onto it. And then where these edges kind of meet, you will see there is then a separation. You can also click on generate it. Okay. So you see we can take a texture and just map it onto a surface, and then the render engine will then take the texture, glue it or project it over it, and then when we do a rendering we can see the texture exactly where we want to see it. Now when I select, for example, the ground plane and I want to go to transform, I want to double check something. Okay, so we have this generated an object and there is this UV. I want to use UV because I would like to show you something. So we will maybe make another viewport, and then here we will go into the UV editor. Okay, let's maybe do a rendering. You see this is just gray. Doesn't really work yet. Good. Okay, so let's go into edit mode, press tab or use the mode switcher. Make sure everything is selected, and then inside the UV editor go to the file selector, and then we will load the concrete image. Let's zoom out a little bit, and you see this is a rectangular image. But if we go into top view, you see our ground plane is actually a square. So how do we now, for example, decide what part of the image should be used to be glued onto this square face? And for that we can use something that's called UV mapping. Basically it's very simple. We define an X and Y coordinate system, and then we glue, or basically we use that coordinate system to glue the texture onto our mesh. Okay, so press U while you're inside the 3D view, and you see it should pull up the unwrapping menu. I think this is also when you press T to open the toolbar. You also have under shading and U, there are UVs. There is, for example, the UV unwrap, same command, unwrap. Okay, and now you see there's actually this rectangle. And let me show you something cool. So this rectangle is put over this part of my texture, and you see there is this kind of grayish element, and it's there. This area is brighter, that's there. Now in the UV editor, I can, for example, scale this down, and you see then in 3D view the texture gets bigger, because essentially I tell the software now use whatever is under this face of the image and scale it or stretch it over this mesh. If I do the reverse, for example, make it bigger, you see I start tiling it. Because wherever the image is done, then it starts tiling it. I could also rotate it. Or I could, for example, G for grab, X along the X-axis, and maybe select a different area of this texture. Okay, and that basically is UV mapping in a nutshell, explained on a very basic face. And then when we now go into rendering, there you see now is, for example, this part projected. And again, there's obviously a lot more to mapping modes and such, specifically those who have a little bit of pre-existing understanding of this stuff. I leave these things out on purpose because this is just a brief introduction into how this process works and what we're going to utilize and explore. And then with the upcoming projects, I go more into detail with how to use different mapping modes and the mapping node in general, etc.